approached the border unlawfully from getting asylum here in the United States. And as we see this go into effect, the plan is that if daily encounters reach 2,500 a day, people trying to cross into the United States at an port of entry, then that would.
Okay, now, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, there we go. Hit the wrong button. Okay, I think I got everybody muted. If you do want to say something, feel free to come off mute, but I think I just muted everyone. Okay, so first thing I want to ask here is, let me put this in here one more time. What one word best describes your role on the team? So go to that link and let me know. Tester, okay. I just want to see kind of who our audience is here. What one word describes your role on the team? Business analyst, okay, very good. What else? We got, okay, product manager, it looks like agile coach, point master. Okay, that's the new one I heard. Scrum master, tester. Okay, we've got a really broad, looks like we've got a broad range here. We've got an engineer, owner, UI SQA developer. Okay, cool. So we've got kind of a broad range of people here, and I think this help talk will be very helpful because, or what we're going to discuss will be helpful regardless of where you're coming from. These are things I think will really, really help any team get more effective at delivering software that customers can actually use. I do want to mention this URL right here. This is the Agile Lunch and Learn YouTube channel. We stream stuff live there. Of course, it's more fun to be joined on this one where you can participate in the chat. But if you're ever looking for something, you want to find something, review something, or show it to someone else, up there where it says live, that live tab up there, if you go to that, it just automatically archives everything that we do here. So be aware that that's there. Also, I will just let you know, I'm with YouTube, we're like right on the verge of hitting their threshold for kind of moving to the next level. So if you feel like it, you can go to this page and play stuff. If you go to the playlist and just let it run even, there's a playlist of all the talks. Anything like that, any views we can get, we've got like a few more weeks to kind of hit their threshold for stuff for I think like 4,000 hours watched or something like that. Anyway, if that sounds interesting to you, here's the page, youtube.com/AgileLNL, Agile Lunch and Learn, Agile LNL, like that. Oh, I went the wrong way. That way. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about user stories. So we use user stories to represent work that we want to do. So question for you is, what best describes your feelings about user stories? Is it A, a silly way to say requirements? B, a very useful way to capture high-level details of real user need? Too little information to be useful for anything. D, usually doesn't represent much of what the user actually wants. Love and adoration for user stories, or loathing and hate. So let me put the link in here one more time. If you bring this link up, you'll be able to add your stuff to the polls. You can also throw it in the chat too. That's great as well. Okay, so it looks like we're compared to how this poll usually goes with people, it looks like we may have all the people, or a high percentage of people that like user stories coming to this. Okay, but we've got about 20% of us say that it's a silly way to say requirements. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I think there is a nuanced difference between what a user story is for and what like the detailed requirements of what you're doing. They work well together, but I think there's some things we ought to consider about how they might be different. C, too little information to really be useful, and then we've got some of us that just love and adoration for user stories. Okay, I'm going to leave this up on the questions. If you think of something you want to ask, or see another question that you want to see us address, vote those up or down here. I'll leave that up, and we'll keep throwing back up there as we go through the talk. Okay, so a user story is something that represents fiction, right? If you create a user story for something that already exists, it's not particularly helpful. But we're thinking of user stories as a fiction that describes how the world's going to be different. It's not that way yet. That's why we're creating a user story for it. So we look at some stories. So here's a bunch of comic books. So these represent stories. A whole comic book is probably larger scale than what we want for a user story. So maybe we look at it through few panels. So here's a Dick Tracy comic, just 3 panels. And this is maybe more on the scale we want for a user story. But when I read this, I don't understand much about it. Somebody's house is sliding into the lake, but I don't know what's going on. This doesn't give me enough information to really do something useful with. However, I think Far Side is a really good example of user stories because Gary Larson's cartoons say so much with so little, right? It gives you all the information you need and nothing extra. I like this one right here. This one doesn't even have any words, but it tells a great story about what's about to happen. I like the genie, this guy on a desert island saying, well, let's see. So far I've got rhythm, I've got music. Actually, who could ask for anything more? So these are very simple stories. But the point I want to make with this is there's a lot of information conveyed in these very, very simple stories. And if we go back and look at some of those other things, they may have just as much graphics, or many, many more words, but tell a less compelling story. So keep that in mind as we're thinking about user stories, that it's not always how big something needs to be. Something doesn't necessarily have to be really big and verbose to convey a lot of information. Like this one right here is one of my favorites. So usually when we're thinking of user stories, we want to convey who, what, and why. Is that, give me a thumbs up if that's what you're doing with user stories. Who, what, and why. Is that generally what you're trying to include in it? Got a thumbs up? Okay, so several of us are, that's what we're trying to do. But I want to point out how. Now, this oftentimes makes its way into a user story, the how we're going to do something. And that's probably not the best use for user stories. And we'll look at some reasons. We'll look at some reasons that we don't want to add how to the user story. Because if we do start adding the how to user stories, they lose a lot of the value they provide. And Tizzy pointed out that the why is often absent. And I would say if you have a user story of just who and what and you leave out the why, that is a recipe for extremely inefficient software development. It's a recipe for not getting the most out of your developers and not getting good communication between what the business is asking for and what the developers are able to produce. Because if we leave out the why, I've been in situations where without the why, we would have built exactly what was asked for, but it turned out when we knew why they were wanting it, they already had that capability in the software. They just didn't know it was there. So that why becomes a very, very important piece for the discussion. So a lot of us probably use something like this where we say and that tells us the who, I want to, and this tells us the what they're trying to do, so I can, and that gives us the why. So this is the template. There's nothing magic about this particular template, but I find it's a very useful thing to kind of start using as a team because it's easier to fill in the blanks sometimes than kind of having writer's block and not sure what to write. Also, if I do it like this, it's usually pretty clear exactly what the who, what, and why is if we're using that same template. But one thing I wanted to suggest, though, is if you're writing a user story and you can express it better without using this template, that should be something you're very comfortable doing, is modifying the template in order to better express what you're trying to say. If we get so rigid on this that we're saying it has to be in this format, even if this makes it read poorly and it doesn't convey things very well, we're probably not actually being agile in the way that we're doing our software development. So let's look at some user stories. So here's one. As a toddler, I want a way to trigger Baby Shark so I can play it on my own. I believe there are toddlers that would be a user story they would like to see. Now notice, it's as a toddler, we know who's the person that's going to benefit from this story. It's a work of fiction, describes a world that does not exist today. It tells them what they want to do. They want to hear Baby Shark. They want some way to start Baby Shark. And the reason is so they can play it on their own. Now, I actually rewrote this when I was going through this presentation because what I had here earlier was I want a button to play Baby Shark. And I realized that inadvertently I had described the how as part of this story. So I changed it to make it clear that the toddler may not care if it's a button, if it's a voice command, if it has to tap its head and wiggle its fingers or something like that. How it actually starts it isn't as important to it as saying, here's what I'm trying to do, the what. So that experience, just going through that this morning, made me realize how easy it is to get that how in there when we want to try to leave that out as much as possible. We want to think about the value this provides, not how we're going to do it. If we presuppose how we're going to do it, we often leave we reduce our efficiency because we're not making the best use of the communication of discussing that when we get ready to actually implement the story. So we should be thinking about how the world will be better. For the toddler, they can listen to Baby Shark anytime they want. Now, for the rest of the family, that might not be a better world, but for the toddler, the person in the user being presented there, it is a win. So here's another example. So as a cow, I want to be milked, so I will be comfortable. This is actually a picture. This is my grandfather and I guess one of my mom's cousins out in, I think that was in Washington State, and that was the family cow that they would milk by hand. So this is from the perspective of a cow. As a cow, I want to be milked, so I will be comfortable. Okay, but we can also think of this from the standpoint of the dairy farmer. As a dairy farmer, I want cows milked on demand so I can maximize production. So there's what the farmer wants. He wants the cows to be milked on demand. And there's why he wants it. He wants to maximize production. Now, how will we achieve this? Well, that's to be determined, right? We're just looking at the value we're wanting to provide, but we're not getting into the how we're going to do it. We're leaving that for later when we actually get ready to work on the story. So some of the hows could be the farmer might decide to staff the barn for 24/7. That might be a way to realize this story. The farmer could also add a buzzer to page him. Anytime the cow comes into the milking stand, the cow walks to the milking stand, he gets a buzzer and has to get up in the middle of the night and go milk the cow. I have some friends here. We live in Fort Scott, Kansas. I've got some friends who live a little ways outside of town, and their solution to this program was 3 of these machines. So these are automatic laser-guided milk machines, and the cow walks in whenever it's starting to feel uncomfortable. The machine figures out what cow it is. It gives it the food that it needs. Gives it the food that it needs, cleans off the udders, figures out where everything is, milks the cow. The cow likes it because it's comfortable. It can give it the medicine that it needs when it comes in. The cow walks back out. So it's not just when the farmer has scheduled to milk the cows. The cows can come in whenever they feel like it. So that is a very technical, very complex solution to that problem. But there's lots of hows. This was the how that they used, and I'm sure they tried a bunch of other hows to that particular thing of maximizing milk production. But stories that support our principles foster good development. And this is a key thing because it's very easy to start creating stories in ways that don't actually support the Agile principles. And if we do that, we're going to create bad stories that actually hinder our development process. And I've seen this with a lot of teams where they come in, they feel like they're not actually making any progress. And then you start looking at their user stories and you realize that the user stories aren't actually aligned with the Agile principles. They're actually working against the Agile principles. So let's talk about the stories a little bit more. So stories start out as fiction. They start out as fiction and they're written from the user's point of view. So if we've got stories that represent fiction from the user's point of view, it's fiction that there is a future where that fiction could become a reality. That means that we should be thinking of progress as being the user can do something new that makes them happy, right? There's something new they can do with the software that they couldn't do before that they see as progress. They see as it makes their life easier or it lets them do something they need to do. But progress is user can do something that makes them happy. So the converse of that would be waste are stories that don't have any return on investment for the user. And this is where a lot of teams struggle because it's really easy to start slipping in a lot of stories that don't actually represent return on investment for the user. And I want to make sure I'm clear here. I'm not just saying that it's not something that's going to eventually benefit the user. I'm saying we're going to create a lot of waste in software development if we use stories that don't represent a clear return on investment for user, even if they are good things to do. Because if it's not driven by the return on investment for the user, we're likely to gold plate it and have the scope, have the scope grow bigger than what it needs to be. There's all kinds of things that can sneak in if we're not laser focused on the return on investment for the user. So here's an example. So here's a story. It says, as a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline. I want continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, so I can deploy to the cloud. So this is not a bad thing, right? Most teams, we want to have this. This is a good thing. This does indirectly benefit the user, right? If we're able to deploy something quickly to the cloud, that is going to help us deliver things for the user. But this kind of violates this stories with no return on investment for the user because there's not something that's helping the user directly. So I may have spoiled my question here, but how does this user story make you feel? When you see a user story like this in your backlog, how does that make you feel? Are you like, yes, this is awesome. I'm so glad we're working on building a continuous delivery pipeline. Our users are going to be so excited about that. Or is it kind of like, oh, great, we're going to have to explain why this is important to them and they're going to feel like they're not getting progress? Yeah, so Jay makes a point, need to morph the story to the user's point of view, which is what we're going to do here in just a second. So go and click on this. Let me throw this link back up here too, because I'd like to see as many people participate on this to see what the feedback is. Okay, so most of us are kind of in the middle. It's not the greatest thing, but it's okay. So Dustin's pointing out that faster releases have value to a user, and that is true. But this story is not from the user point of view, right? So how can we get to a story that gives them? We want CI/CD. I'm not suggesting that we not put in continuous integration, continuous delivery, but if we are taking steps that are not from the user's point of view, it's very easy to build stuff and not have those guardrails that keep us laser focused on exactly what the user does. So we need to build a continuous integration, continuous deployment in incremental steps that are tied to things that help the user. If you don't do that, you can get into situations where you got build CI/CD and you spend a year trying to build stuff for everything you could possibly need instead of taking those incremental steps. So let's look at an example of what we could do. So as a developer, I want a CI/CD pipeline so I can deploy to the cloud. Well, that's not going to be a good story. It's not bad to build a pipeline, but what might happen if we treat the pipeline as progress, we may do a huge amount of work that turns out not to be useful. We also may lose the confidence of our users because we're working on lots of stuff and they're not actually seeing things that they measure as progress. So this story is probably something we want to avoid. This is not a story that's going to establish a lot of trust with our users. But consider this story. As a user, I want to see the logo so I know I'm on the right site. So if our definition of done is something gets deployed to the cloud and that it has to be done through automated processes, this story right here is going to create a large portion of what we need in the continuous integration, continuous delivery space. It's not going to create everything. In this particular case, we'll probably, if we're deploying to the cloud, this might just deploy something to an S3 bucket, making sure it's shared or whatever we're using like that. There's lots of things we don't necessarily have to stand up a database, but we're building this slice all the way through, but delivered of a piece of what we need in the continuous integration side of things. But it's all written exactly from what the user knows what to expect and that they're going to see some progress. It would appear that the reason that this is sometimes hard to sell to developers is they think, oh, but there's all this other stuff I need. I might as well do it at the same time. But in my experience, whenever we start thinking like that and it's not driven by exactly the next thing we give the user, it's very easy to start slipping things in that we're like, oh, we're going to need this. And later it turns out we don't. Or, oh, I think this should be done this way, but we're not actually trying to execute it against something. And so it turns out we have to come back in and change it. And it's not a problem to need to change things. It's very good to take incremental steps, but if I'm building something without having anything guiding it from the standpoint of what the user needs, I'm likely to become very, very inefficient, much more inefficient than the small gain I might make by not building it incrementally. So just getting this in place, the other thing you may have people kind of push back a little bit on this is saying, oh, well, this would be so simple, it wouldn't take very long at all. Well, that's great. Get the story done and then move on to the next one. The first time you do something like this, though, it usually takes quite a bit of effort. You have to make a pretty good investment in everything you're doing to get this actually to work right. You're going to have to probably set up your permissions, and you may have to deal with security. And I mean, there's lots of things that go into doing this first story. So making it as small as possible is a very good first step. This also will prove out the continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline is capable of deploying the application. I've worked on some projects that they decided they didn't want to touch the application until they had built out a lot of this type of infrastructure, and they put months of effort into building out the infrastructure for deploying the application. Well, as they got into actually building the application, they kept running into problems deploying stuff because it was built with one type of mindset. And as they started building the application, they discovered these little nuances of how things needed to work. And it was really, really difficult to come back and actually evolve the continuous delivery because it didn't grow up lockstep with what the application needed. So that's one thing about doing this. If we actually show the users the logo, then we're showing, at least we can do that. We can show them the logo. At least that part does what we need for the application. So why do software projects fail? Well, they fail because they fail to when we fail to deliver working software. That's what causes software to fail. And I think this is a very important thing to think about, because if we don't have this in the back of our minds that this is what it actually means to fail, it's very easy for us to batch things together in ways that put off delivering working software in ways that inadvertently dramatically create the risk of some type of failure. So think of how to describe that. If we're recognizing that failure means we haven't delivered working software, we should be thinking in terms of how do we bring our ability to deliver stuff, bring that to the beginning, delivering things that the user can actually see as value. Even if we get something out, like for the logo example, I think I mentioned this last time we met. Even if we deliver a logo and they don't know what the logo needs to be, so we just make one up and deliver it, and then we come back in and change it later, we've actually delivered something, though, that works. We're able to show them the logo. Even if we change it later, that is better progress because we've delivered something that works, even if we're going to move it later. We also want to build from the user's perspective. This is very important if the user is actually paying the bills, right? If they're the ones that's paying the development or somehow related to paying the development for the development process, the longer you wait before you start showing them what you're doing, the easier it is to lose the trust and either get the budget cut or the project canceled or whatever. And that does happen. I've seen projects that put so much into wait, they waited so long to start showing the user things the users could actually touch and feel and do things with, that the people funding it lost confidence and actually shut down project, even after spending millions of dollars on it. So how does the user think about software? If we want to show the user progress, we need to think about how the user actually thinks about the software. So let's jump over and make an analogy. So I live down in Fort Scott, down here, and Kansas City is up there. So Kansas City is the nearest really large city. We go there, work for, we've got projects with clients up in Kansas City, so we're kind of back and forth there. Matter of fact, just drove back late last night when we came into the airport. So being able to drive back and forth between Fort Scott and Kansas City is very important. Well, let's assume that there's not a road for some reason. So me, as a driver of a car, I want trees cleared from Fort Scott to Kansas City so we can level it. So we can, after the trees are cleared, then we can level it and we can work toward building a highway. So that's a pretty big project. This would not take, well, one thing about this, just because I've cleared the trees, I still may not be able to drive on it, depending on what my car is. So even if this is delivered as a driver of a car, I may not have actually gotten anything out of what's been done here. So let's try to scale it back. So let's split this story. So what if I say this, as a driver of a car, I want a highway from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth. So Pleasanton's down here. So maybe there's something I need to go to Pleasanton for. So if I had a highway, it doesn't get me all the way to Kansas City, but as a small thing, I could start getting some value from it. Well, that's still a pretty big thing, right? Getting a highway all the way there. And maybe I get to Pleasanton and decide I don't like Pleasanton. It's not as pleasant as I thought it would be. So once I'm there, it's not a place I want to go back to. Well, if I put all this effort into a highway, that's a pretty big expense. So what if I did something like this and say, as a driver of a 4x4, so I can drive some places I can't go with a car, I want a trail from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can travel in good weather. Now, I just constrained this a lot smaller. Maybe this is the smallest thing I could possibly do to get to Pleasanton. Notice I've even ruled out driving in the rain, right? It only works when it's in good weather. But I just need a trail. I want to get to Pleasanton. We're going to deliver something that allows me to get to Pleasanton and see if that's actually something that's valuable. It's a small step, but it lets me actually do the thing that I'm trying to do, which is to get from Fort Scott to somewhere else. So I've got a trail, right? And I need a really good 4x4 to do it, but I can actually get to Pleasanton. So then after I do that, I get my 4x4 and I'm going back and forth to Pleasanton. And then I discover, like, this is really valuable. I need to be able to go in the rain because I need to go every day. There's something really valuable in Pleasanton, so we need to be able to go back and forth. So maybe we write another story. And it's like, okay, as a driver of a car, I want a gravel road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth. And maybe that's valuable because now I've got an actual road and I can go most of the times of the year. Can't necessarily go super fast. It's a gravel road, but I'm able to get back and forth. So now I've got something that's better than just it's much better than not being able to go at all. Then we put in the trail. The trail was better than not being able to go at all. Now we got a gravel road, which is much better than the trail. I can now do this in a car instead of a 4x4. So maybe the next thing is, as a driver of a car, I want a paved road from Fort Scott to Pleasanton so I can drive back and forth at higher speeds. And maybe that's the next thing I do. So now I've moved with something that's got pavement. Well, once I've got that, maybe I'm like, okay, now we're going to take the next incremental step toward Kansas City. That trail worked okay for a while. Let's see if we'd like going to Kansas City. So now let's go ahead and maybe these things are even happening in parallel. Now let's get a trail all the way to Kansas City or to some other town on the way to Kansas City. So now I've got my trail there. As a 4x4, I can go back and forth in good weather. But, why are we doing this? We want a highway, don't we? Well, what if we change our mind once we get there? We get to Kansas City and discover that Kansas City is not a place we want to go to, right? We've made it to Kansas City, and then we think about the highway and say, on second thought, let's not build a highway to Kansas City because it is a silly place. We don't want to go to Kansas City. It turns out that wasn't what we wanted to do. Well, by building a trail first and actually doing the simplest thing we can, we actually can get that experience and redirect. Maybe we discover that going to Pleasanton, the trail to Kansas City doesn't produce that much more value to us than being able to get back and forth quickly to Pleasanton for some reason. So one thing to think about in this is how much money is invested in software that turns out not to do what is needed. Because it made sense, thought we needed it, but we're going all the way to Kansas City, and then we get to Kansas City first time and decide, yeah, you know what, that's not what we need to do. Maybe we discover, if we build a highway to Kansas City and discover that the city has been taken over by zombies, and we decide, you know what, maybe having a really nice, smooth highway to walk from Kansas City back to our house is not what we want at all, right? We've got this trail and we can kind of destroy it as we go back home and hope that they never make it this far south. So it's a silly example, but there are situations that are like that, where we build a bunch, put a bunch into software and build something that seemed like a really good idea at the time. So we build it as robustly as we could, and then we discover that doesn't actually work well for us. So those incremental steps can help us prove out things and help us redirect as we discover what works well and what doesn't. So somebody mentioned vertical slices, and yes, so if we take a look at this, here's our famous cake. Sounds like you've been to get. I came back from Kansas City at midnight last night, so that was my experience, and we made it past all the zombies without any problem. So here's our cake application. We've got our hardware down at the bottom, then we've got database layer and business layer and user interface layer. So I want this slice right here said no user ever, right? Your users don't come to you and say, you know what I really want is a really good database layer for this application that I can't touch, I don't have access to, but I just really want a database layer built for this application. Doesn't make my life any easier because it doesn't have an interface to it, but that's really what I want you to deliver is a database layer. Now, if you've got a kid, you might have this. You might have a kid that says, only eats the frosting, says, these are the slices I want, just the pieces that have the frosting on it. But the way that users usually think about this is slices that go all the way through, right? If you're dealing with an application, let's say an accounting application or something like that, they're going to be thinking in terms not of, oh, here's the database, here's the user interface, there's the hardware. They're going to be thinking in terms of a slice like this that might be, here's the thing that lets me write checks, or here's the thing that lets me process payroll, or here's the slice all the way through that lets me do my reports for taxes. And those slices go all the way through. Now, as a developer, it's very easy for me to want to build like this. And I'm very sympathetic to that because this is how I think of it, is like, let's get the database done. But it's a very inefficient way to work because I'm not getting that feedback from the users. And if I'm thinking in terms of this, I can't have good conversations with the user about what we're building in order to help really be efficient at what delivers the best return on investment. Because if I start talking about, well, here's the database for you, that doesn't mean anything to the user. But if I'm talking about, here's how we're going to let you write your checks, and I'm building just what I need in the database, just what I need in the business logic, just what I need in the user interface, and just what I need to deploy on the hardware or to be able to deploy it, I'm able to have conversations that are much more tuned into what the user actually needs to do with the application. And with talking to the user, the skill I can bring as a developer and the business understanding that they bring as the user of the application, we're able to make much, much better decisions than if either of us were just working, independently without having those conversations. Now, the thing that often comes up is say, well, if you build a house, you have to build build the foundation first. And yes, that is true if you're building a house, but code lets us do things that we can't do with a house. If you build a house and you need to just tear out the foundation because you decided to build it somewhere else, that's a pretty invasive thing. In software, if we're building it well and we're building our software with the expectation it's going to change, we can actually, it's not a crazy thing to say, hey, I'm going to build this. This is what we're going to use today. Then we're going to switch over to this other database layer, but this lets us deliver something today. That's a very common thing in Agile teams, is to build something that lets you start getting feedback on it, starts letting them use it, but just takes that next most simple step toward what the customer is asking for. And I put this in here, it meant something, but oh yeah, so I was just showing how we're taking these incremental steps, and in some way, maybe it would be more efficient to start. We might be able to make an argument of saying would be more efficient to start just trying to build the highway. But if we're not even sure, if we haven't even proved out we want to go to this destination, building the highway would be massively inefficient because there may be some chance that we don't want to go there, or we don't need to go all the way. Or once we get there, we discover, hey, you know what? The gravel road works just fine. This is fairly infrequent, and based on the vehicles they're actually using it now, we'll wait to put the highway in until we actually have justification for it. So in thinking of these things with, thinking of cakes and buildings and highways and stuff, there is a great power and great danger when we start talking about metaphors. Metaphors are tied very closely to the way that we think about things. We take these physical experiences and use them to think about abstract ideas. And software is very interesting because it's so abstract because you don't see bits. You see what it does, but it's hard to really understand. It's hard to really think about what's going on behind the scenes without resorting to some types of metaphor. So one thing I like to encourage teams when I'm working with development teams is I try to get them to think more that they're sketching an application and growing it that way rather than thinking of carving it in stone. So, you draw the horse, you draw a line and another line, then you delete some of it and you kind of let it evolve. But it's not a big deal to put a line in that you use for a while and then erase that line when you've got a better representation of the horse. As opposed to doing something in stone where you're actually, you better not mess up. It has to be this way. This is the way it will be for the next thousands of years. I think a better metaphor probably than a lot of the building stuff is to think of software being more closely to growing a city. Because cities are something that respond to change, right? You put in a subway system because that's where people need to be. And later you put another subway system because patterns have changed and the city has grown in different ways. And it's not bad that you put in a subway system that worked for a while, even if you close it off later and something else replaces it. So that idea of growing versus building, I think, is very important when we think of software, and especially when we think of user stories, is how we take these incremental steps to grow and evolve the software instead of thinking of our user stories being this. Instead of thinking of the user stories being something that's like pouring concrete, we've got to get the stories in place for how we're going to pour the concrete. What time is it? I'm going to skip over this one to have more time to talk about some questions at the end. So let's consider a system that looks like this. We've got these different, we're getting ready to, let's say we're trying to build a new system. We've got an old system in place that's running. We're going to build a new system to replace it with. Yes, ship of Theseus. So in this case, we've got things that are, what is that, yellow? Those are stories that are capable of demonstration. They create a rough means of producing the desired result. Like maybe it's going to be something that's going to have 5 screens that you walk through with a wizard is where we want to head. But we get just a single screen that has just the most important fields on it that let us create an account or whatever it is. So it's capable of demonstration. It's not something that we even think we can deploy to production, but it is a first step, something we start getting feedback on because it shows that the software does something that the user has asked for, even if it's not doesn't have all the things around it that the user is going to need. Then the orange color is things that are deployable to production. So for example, you need security around things to deploy to production. Maybe our capable of demonstration doesn't even have a user login, but then we put a user login around it and make it, or the things that have user login around it and are have security, those we can actually deploy all the way through to production. And then the green are the things that meet the threshold of being viable as a system of record. So the bare minimum features to be able to run in place of the current system. So these are all subsets or supersets of each other. And the blue is existing features that we want in the new system, but we could go live without. And then the purple, I guess that's purple, are the new features. So enhancements that the current state doesn't have today, but they may be part of the driving factor of why we're actually doing this rewrite. So if this is time going this way, and if we were to order these things, one thing I've seen a lot of teams do is they actually start with some of the purple new features when they're writing something new because they want to show how valuable this is, this thing that they're building. And there might be some reasons for doing that, but I just want to show you an alternative path that may be lower risk. So they start off with some purple features. Now, those are new enhancements the current system doesn't have today. So we don't actually need them to replace what the system does today. Then they get one and they do an orange one, which is something that's deployable to production. So that would probably be something the system does today. Then we do another new feature. Then we do a green one, which meets the threshold of viable as a system of record. And we go all the way through and we get to here and then the system can go live. Well, if we take all these stories and rearrange them like this, we're now in a very different situation because we've got all the bare minimum stories that are just capable of demonstration, but we couldn't deploy. And then we follow that with the orange ones down there that are things we could deploy to production. And then we get through the things that are viable of the system of record way over here before we even get to the blue. And you've probably seen the example of a skateboard and then a scooter and bicycle, motorcycle, and car. What we've done is we've ordered these in such a way that lets us first start getting some feedback from things. So the skateboard, you can get back and forth between 2 points. That's all it does. And then we've added some that maybe are at the skateboard level and then moved to the place where it's a bicycle. And by the time we get to bicycle, maybe we're at something that this is a viable system. It could run in place of the old system. We could cut over this today if we wanted to. Now, we've got all these other features that even the old system does, but they're maybe not being completely necessary in order to cut over to it. So like an example of something that might be the blue here, was working on a system and they needed to be able to change what the holiday dates were. And the old system had a UI that you could go in and change the holiday dates. It was a very important thing for the users. But when we were really looking at what was important to us, we decided that was actually something that the existing system did, but we would be willing to go live without it. So we delayed that. We ordered that to do it later because they said if we really needed to change something, we could put this directly into the database. We could just tell the tell the DBAs, fill out, here's the spreadsheet, put this in, these are the calendar, the holiday dates for next year. So it wasn't something that would impede them. They still wanted it, but it wasn't something that prevented them from going to production. If they had have taken that blue one and done it at the very, very beginning, that was coming at the expense of something else that would prevent them from going to production. So if we think of ordering things in this way, we come over here and this is the only option we can get to where we can go live is to finish all these things. On the other hand, this one down here, once we get past to the bicycle stage and we've got the bicycle, we've now got many options of when to go live. The users can decide when they want to actually cut over and then we'll start doing the development on the new system. This produces a lot less risk for us than this does. And so if we're able to do our user stories in ways that get in both the sequencing and the scope of the stories, in ways that help make sure that we get to this state as soon as possible, get to that bicycle state as soon as possible, we now give a lot more control, a lot lower risk, but give a lot more control to the business side of things of when they want to actually cut over. And if you have a project that could go live today, if they wanted to, and we're continuing to make progress on more of what they want, but it could go live today, there is a much lower risk of that project getting canceled than a project that's saying in a year we'll have everything that you possibly could want, but we don't have anything that you could actually cut over to today. So this is about lowering our risk. And let's look at another view of this. And this is when we're thinking of user stories and what we put in them and what we leave out. If this up at the top represents one sequence, so in this case we've got minimally viable story, something that represents existing functionality, and then something that's new features. If we order these like this, we're getting over here, we're doing a new feature as the second thing that we're working on. As far as replacing a system, that probably should be toward the end, unless there's some really compelling reason. If we order them like this, we now come over here, and the minimally viable system, we could go live once we finish those orange ones or yellow ones, and then continue to iterate on. But these are the same bars, just doing them in a different way, different color. And when we think of stories, we can start doing things like this too. So this represents that same thing we just looked at. But if we look at that first story and say, is there any way to make this any smaller? We might find we can split it out into half of it being minimally viable and half of it being existing functionality, like that very first thing there. And if we split all these things out, we find things that we can split these things into two different parts. Some of them have to be done. Some of them could be delayed if we're willing to do that. We can now reorder them so it looks like this. Well, we've just pushed when we could go live a lot closer to the start date, which lowers our risk significantly. The other thing about starting to split stuff up is we may find when we start splitting stuff up that there's some things that maybe we even just decide not to do at all. And if we push those all to the very end, we're now in a position to where maybe we get to here and that's fine. But if we hadn't done these things earlier, we can't go back and trade the time we spent on them. We can't trade the time we spend on them for other stories. So these are just different ways to think about user stories and why we want to split them, why we want to keep them small, and why we want to keep them very, very focused on what delivers value to the user. Because if we start working on a user story that's not driven by what the user is asking for, it's very, very easy for them to expand in scope and start encompassing things, like in this case, start encompassing things that are new features just because we know we want to go there, when really that's creating a lot of risk for our project because it's pushing out when we could actually go live, and it's pushing out how long it is before we can show the users, hey, look at this valuable thing we've created for you. I'll go through this example just kind of really quickly. So let's say that Sam's Shoes is an very old, very prestigious shoe company that has always sold shoes to this town's, to their fathers, their grandfathers, and their great-grandfathers. It's been around for years. And they're dealing with the internet starting to encroach on some of their business. It's still run by Sam, but he's the great-great-grandson of the original Sam. So as Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. So is this a good user story? What do you think? Is this a good user story? So I've got who, I've got what, and I've got why. So it does tell us some things about it. I would suggest, so Daniel's giving a thumbs down. This is pretty broad, right? This could encompass all kinds of things in here. And if we want working software to be our primary measure of progress, then we probably want to find some way to make this a lot smaller, something that we can deliver and say, yes, we are able to do this, and it be something that happens on a short time frame. Now, an even worse user story is something like this. I've actually seen people try to, I've seen this in a Dilbert cartoon, but I've seen people actually try to write stories like this. As a user, I want the system to work, so I will be happy. Well, that's even worse, so don't do that. Let's head in the other direction. How do we make it smaller? So Sam says, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. What if we do something like that? Well, this could encompass a shopping cart, credit card processing, loyalty program, customer login, saved addresses, inventory, recommendation. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could be part of this. And let's assume that we can't just stand up a e-commerce site. Maybe we could get all those things just for free with off the shelf. For some reason, we have to build this. So one way might be that I've seen a lot of developers will try to split this up and say, as a developer, I want an API to the database so web services can query it and build something like that. Well, this is actually a good step, right? This is something that we need. But I'm not really taking a step that I can actually show to the user. This doesn't give Sam anything, and Sam may not even understand what we're building for him if we write a story like this. But what if we do something like this and say, as a customer, I want to see inventory so I can call to order. Now, notice with this story, we could be creating all kinds of APIs and everything. There's lots of stuff we could create as part of this. A lot of what would happen in this story, we will create as part of this, but we only create the pieces that we need to achieve this business outcome. So we're just trying to list the inventory on the website so people can go and they can call or decide to visit the store. There's nothing can be ordered. I mean, it's all just set up to where we're just taking that very small step. But this is a significantly constrained, this represents a slice all the way through, where this does not necessarily represent a slice all the way through. This story right here represents something that we can leave we feel very comfortable leaving all kinds of things out because we're very focused on exactly what we know what this means, and we can see that this will deliver a return on investment just the way it is for the customer. If we go to this one though, what's going to happen as a developer is, since this doesn't deliver something just directly for the customer, it's going to be easy for us to slide a lot of other things in, because there's nothing saying, do we need this to deliver what the customer is expecting as value? There's no way to have that conversation, those constraints on this. So it can tend to grow and take a lot more time before they start actually getting something that they can give us feedback on. So let's say we deliver this, and this sounds really simple, right? But there's lots of things that have to happen as part of this. We have to somehow create a mechanism to talk to the database. We may be able to get by without having SSL on the website because we're just showing the inventory. Nowadays, you would probably put SSL on it, but there's some things we can leave out there. There's lots of stuff, security stuff, that doesn't need to happen as part of this because we're not actually dealing with people's orders and credit cards. It's just listing stuff out. We might even find a way just to push this out as a static page that gets updated every 5 minutes with the current inventory. If we wanted to just test out, does Sam's customers even use the web? Would they even go to it? That might give us some feedback and adjust what we want to build. But let's say we end up with something like this, right? Sam's Shoes, call to order 1-800-SAMS Shoe, and here's our shoes and the prices. So they can, and Sam's Shoes is so prestigious, all the descriptions are actually in Latin. That gives you an idea of how long ago or how old this company is. So what's the return on investment from doing something like this? Well, hopefully we get some orders, right? Hopefully some people go to the website and buy shoes from us that might not have bought shoes from us otherwise. Another big return on investment is we start getting metrics and we see how many people actually go to this. We've now got this website. We're putting it on our catalogs that we're sending out. We're letting people know about it. Are people going to this website? What type of devices are they using? Maybe we find out most of our customers only use mobile, or most of our customers are using very large screen TVs at home to visit these sites, or whatever it happens to be. We also can start proving out some of our assumptions. Now, this story, you probably heard of Zappos. They were bought by Amazon, and they kind of did something similar to this when they were starting on the business side. Instead of buying lots of shoes and then trying to figure out if they could sell them online, they wanted to ask themselves, how can we try to sell shoes online to get feedback of, will people even buy shoes online? Maybe people are really, grossed out by the idea of putting something on their feet that came through the mail or through UPS. So what they ended up doing is they went down to Foot Locker, bought a bunch of shoes, took pictures of the shoes, returned the shoes to Foot Locker, put them up on their website. People could call or order over the internet. And then when they order one, they go back to Foot Locker, buy the shoes, and ship it to them. So they were testing out their ideas with the simplest thing that could possibly work, even though you'd think, first you need to establish a warehouse. Well, they didn't want to build a warehouse until they actually knew that people were willing to buy shoes online. And then they were able to grow it from there incrementally. Now, that's not, that wasn't necessarily the way they were building their software with user stories, but I think that's a very good example of how we can do things that are driven by the value and the feedback we provide, rather than just what are all the things we need to possibly build. So what could the next story be? Well, the next story might be something like the simplest next step. As a customer, I want to order online so I don't have to call. So maybe we just make it really simple like this, where you can just click, and I've seen some websites start out like this. You click on it, you click on order, it takes you to a page, you can fill out your credit card information, and they ship it to you. So you type in size and information. This doesn't have a shopping cart. We're not saving the credit card. Maybe that's handled through something that's not even hosted on our site. Maybe we just take PayPal or whatever it is. But we're taking a step toward what we need. We can deploy it. They can start using it and get feedback. Maybe the next thing is we want to add a shopping cart. But all these decisions can be made in conversation with the user and the customer out what's the next step you want to take that will give you a return on investment. And all of these stories are driven by how the customer will experience this and what's the value that will be provided by it. So we make this. Now we've got a button to add to the shopping cart. And these examples show you why they don't hire me to do the UI for e-commerce stuff. And then we can remove it from the shopping cart, something like that. Well, then we might go on to stories about, saving their address so they don't have to re-enter it. Maybe Sam Shoes discovers that lots of their people keep coming back and they buy shoes every month. Their clientele or such like that, so they don't have to re-enter their address each time. So that becomes higher priority than something else. Or maybe it's don't want to have to re-enter their credit card. So there's all these things that could be, we don't even know what the next most important thing is until we actually start getting feedback from them to try it. Okay, so it's kind of back to the ship of Theseus, but a question I wanted to ask, then we'll look at taking some questions if anybody's got questions about user stories. But at what point do you have a new software application? Is it when the last line of the original code base has been replaced through a process of weekly changes? Is it when new application is created and the old data is migrated over? Or is it either way, it's a new application? And there's not a right or wrong answer here to this, but what I want us to think about, though, is this idea of growing an application. And maybe the question of when we have a new application kind of presupposes that we're dealing more with a project where we're going to do this and be done, and less with the idea of we're going to grow this application in response to business needs. And it's an organic thing that we add different parts to it and take parts away as the user keeps asking for things and as their business needs change. And what I want to suggest is the way to drive that type of organic growth can be done very effectively through user stories if we're careful how we write them and have them all really laser focused on the return on investment they provide for the user. So look like we've got a couple different opinions here on stuff. And like I said, the takeaway here is just thinking about how do we grow our application over time. Okay, so that covers what I wanted to make sure we got through today. I hope that was useful. I don't see any questions in here. If anyone has any questions, I'd love to talk about them. So if you got a question, hop on video and let's hear it, or suggestions or aggravations or disagreements. Those are all great.